about. And special thanks to Kevin for all the work he's done to set this up in this unexpected format. I don't think it's gonna, I think it may come across pretty well, let's hope. Probably not any worse than trying to be in a meeting room. You'll probably be able to see the screen better. I want to acknowledge the various partners in this project that Kevin hasn't already mentioned. Pepperwood Preserve has helped us with some technical details, particularly with climate modeling and some scenarios we're looking at. Friends of Mark West Watershed has been very helpful in many ways, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Sonoma County Regional Parks has also allowed us a lot of access and is participating in the study. I am the CEO of Coast Range Watershed Institute, which is a science and education nonprofit. I'm also president of OEI, which is doing the modeling work. Coast Range will be a repository of the work products and a point of contact for follow-on efforts with the model after the project is complete. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So it's taken us a long time to get to this point. I remember an effort with Ray Krause, resident in Mark West Creek, starting about 10 years ago, trying to get something like this going, and boy, it's really gratifying to finally get here. Special acknowledgements again, Friends of Mark West Watershed and the Monans Rill community, Penny Srota, Harriet Buckwalter, and several others who helped get us on the ground out there, connected us with many other landowners. Thanks to also to many landowners who helped us with our monitoring efforts. There were many people let us do some monitoring work on their wells and groundwater levels in their wells and put up with that inconvenience. Thank you very much. Jim Dirksen has been very helpful in providing us background materials and access to the creek to do some gauging work. I also, the work we did beginning in the fall of 2016 at Monans Rill, these photos on the right-hand side of the screen here, sort of, we're kind of the kernel of how this project got started in earnest. That top image is a small watershed map, and the different colors are different geologies, but you can see there's one small watershed outlined in black that's got a lot of green color in it, which is a certain type of rock that's very different than the rest of the rock. And this set up a pretty natural paired watershed study for us to start looking at some of the questions about how groundwater works and how surface water works in this system. And the geologic contrast was an important one for us to look at. We got some help over the years with that from residents at Monans Rill, and we also got some help from people like some interns at Healdsburg High School, who are pictured there in the bottom. And again, we can't thank Wildlife Conservation Board enough for for funding this work, which couldn't have happened obviously without it. Next slide, please. So there are some limitations I want to point out. What we're presenting here is pretty final, but it's still preliminary. We expect this is going to be, what we're presenting is going to be consistent with the final report due June 1. There could be some minor changes. The findings that we've got here are derived from a calibrated numerical computer model, simulating the hydrologic cycle on the landscape. And what we're providing you here are best available estimates of actual conditions. Watershed and subwatershed scale results are likely more accurate than very site-specific results. The modeling work here is pretty granular. It's supported by LiDAR, so we can show things in great detail. And we're just making this statement so that you wouldn't necessarily expect that what's happening in one particular pixel of this modeling work is going to necessarily be exactly what you see on the ground in the hydrologic process, but we think it's very representative. One other thing, at the end of the presentation, there will be a lot of discussion of model scenarios, and these are hypotheticals. They represent potential management actions, and those management actions we believe are feasible, but these scenarios that we're presenting don't imply any commitment or responsibility to plan or implement any of these actions. And one last thing, you'll note in the lower right-hand corner of these slides is a number for each slide, and if you've got a question going forward, you might want to take note of the slide numbers for reference if we need to go back to it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jeremy Kobor.
All right, thanks a lot, Matt. Quick overview of the agenda for the rest of the presentation. Going to touch on the goals and the approach we took for this study. Talk very briefly about the model development and calibration of the model. I'm not going to dwell on that part of the work very much because we want to get through all the results and findings from the study. We have some earlier presentations that cover that material in more detail, and of course I'm happy to answer any questions about model development and calibration. Once we go through that, we'll talk about the existing hydrologic conditions in the watershed, things like water balances, stream flow information. We'll also talk about the existing habitat conditions for salmonids as they relate to things like flow and temperature. And then maybe about the midway through the presentation, we'll switch to talking about the various scenarios that Matt was just talking about. So these are asking what if questions of the model to try to understand what actions may be more or less effective at improving or sustaining stream flow in the watershed. And then at the end, and actually kind of periodically throughout, we'll touch on some of the key findings and recommendations, conclusions from the study. So beginning with the goals and approach to the project, I think we've already mentioned it was a 3-year study funded by Wildlife Conservation Board. We really view this not so much as a study, but as the development of a management tool. One of the most useful ways to think about and use a hydrologic model like this is as a management tool that you continue to use and ask new questions of or update as new data becomes available. The model really gathers information from a lot of different available sources. We're pretty data rich in the Russian River watershed, so we try to take into account most of what's already been done in the past and build that into our model. Provides a comprehensive description of the hydrologic conditions in the watershed and the different processes at play. Then we try to use that simulation model to predict the location and quantity of stream flows. We try to relate those stream flow conditions to requirements for salmonids. And we also look at how those conditions vary under different future and existing historical climate conditions. One of the main goals in doing the modeling is to understand what is the cumulative effect of land and water use actions happening in the watershed on stream flow conditions. We tried to prioritize reaches, understand where the reaches that are providing the most habitat value, where habitat enhancement work should be focused going forward. And we also tried to predict the effectiveness of different strategies to maintain and enhance summer stream flow. Really, this is maybe the main point of the study. The grant program is actually called the Streamflow Enhancement Program. It's really all about understanding the controls on stream flow and what actions we could take to maintain or enhance those stream flows going forward. So the model we use is called Mike-Shee. It's an integrated hydrologic model. It's fairly complex, has a lot of data requirements. However, it is pretty intuitive. It's based on the water cycle, so it simulates all of the major land-based phases in the hydrologic cycle. Things like precipitation, evapotranspiration, runoff over the landscape. It has a soil moisture component or an unsaturated zone component. It also has a groundwater model, which is pretty similar to ModFlow that some people might be familiar with. And of course, it has a hydrologic surface water model, which is pretty similar to HEC-RAS that people might be familiar with. And all those different processes are integrated in the model, so there's feedbacks between the different storages and flows between these individual pieces of the water cycle. So in addition to all the natural processes, we try to include the various man-made influences on the landscape. In terms of water, that's really things like irrigation, primarily vineyard irrigation, groundwater pumping from wells, whether that's for residential use or agricultural uses. We represent on-stream ponds in the model, and we also represent surface water diversion, so where people are extracting water from the creek for various purposes. So trying to cover model development or about 1 year worth of project work in a single slide. This is what we've come up with. It's essentially showing that the model's built on a series of spatially distributed inputs. So description of the climate, description of the topography in the stream channel network, what does the land cover look like, where are there surface diversions. We looked at the soil conditions, and also the underlying hydrogeology and distribution of groundwater wells. So in addition to a lot of spatial information, there's various hydrogeologic and vegetation properties behind these maps, as well as various time series describing things like pumping rates, precipitation rates, etc. So a model is really only as good as the degree of calibration that you've done to the model. So we can build a nice model and simulate conditions, but we really need to spend energy on this step of ensuring that our model is agreeing with reality. That was probably a 9-month process for this model. We primarily calibrated the model to available Streamflow information. We had 2 gauges to work with. We had about 5 years worth of data in the upper watershed at Rancho Mark West, and also about 2 years of data that we helped develop farther down in the lower part of our study area by Michelle Way. So I'm showing a couple examples of that calibration. So we're comparing what does the model simulate the streamflow should be, and that's in the orange colors, and then what was observed or measured in the field in blue. So on the top you can see we've calibrated to the entire hydrologic water year, trying to match discharges during runoff events as well as during base flow. That's an example of the calibration at Michelle Way on the top there. On the bottom, you can see we've really focused our calibration effort not just on the full water year, but really on the time of year where we're most concerned with flow, or we believe flow is most limiting for salmonids. And that's basically the spring and the summer months. You can see we've done a pretty good job of capturing the spring flow recession. So that's when flow begins to drop off in the spring and early summer. And then that base flow period that we get in the late summer, where we usually reach our minimum stream flows. So that's really all I'm going to say about the model development and calibration, because we just have too much in this meeting. We're going to focus primarily on results here. So this slide shows some of our results characterizing the water use in the watershed. This is a pretty big part of the model development. On the left there, you can see a breakdown of use categories. So of that total water use of about 430 acre-feet per year, approximately half of that was for residential use, we found, and about a third of it was for vineyard irrigation. And then the remainder there is a number of different use categories. Of possible interest is the 3% for cannabis irrigation. We went through quite a substantial effort to identify both permitted cannabis operations and unpermitted outdoor cannabis to really make sure we weren't underestimating that component. We think we have a pretty good handle on that, and it's really not a huge piece of the water use picture. It is significant, but residential and vineyard irrigation are clearly the largest water uses. I should take a step back and mention some of our data sources for this, which I don't think I talked about. We have the state water rights database, which we mine for its information. We have census data that help us understand how many people live in various portions of the watershed. And then we have the information order that the water board put out during the recent drought. And that provided really a lot of valuable information, not only on use rates, but what types of uses were occurring where, and other information like that. So we brought all those things together to come up with these use estimates. If you look at the pie chart on the right, you'll see that shows the breakdown of whether water is used for groundwater versus surface water. So groundwater is primarily, the dominant use in the watershed, about 85% of the total use. And then of that 15% that is surface water use, really about 3/4 of that is from pond storage, and only about 1/4 of that is direct diversion. So, water coming directly out of a stream rather than from a pond. So one of the main overall types of results we get from a model like this is what we call a water balance. So like the rest of everything else on Earth, we follow conservation of mass in thinking about hydrology and the water cycle. And that essentially means that all the inflows to the watershed are going to be matched by outflows from the watershed unless you have some kind of a change in storage in the system. And that's what this shows here. Looking at the entire watershed, there's really only two main inflows, precipitation and irrigation. Of course, precipitation is almost all of that. Moving on to outflows, the two largest are Streamflow, which I think most people understand, and what I'm calling AET here. That stands for actual evapotranspiration. So that's the amount of water that's used by plants as transpiration, plus the water that evaporates into the atmosphere from the soil or the land surface as evaporation. Those two summed together are called actual evapotranspiration, or AET. So what you'll notice is you get wide variations of precipitation, typical in Northern California, something like 20 inches a year in a dry year like 2014, up to more than 60 years watershed average in a wet year like 2017. That 10-year average condition was something like 36 or 37 inches per year, and that represents our full simulation period that we looked at, which was basically water year 2010 through 2019. If you look at some of the other components, you'll notice they don't vary as much. Things like AET, relatively steady, whether you're in a wet or a dry water year, at least compared to precipitation. Stream flow varies pretty widely. And then if you go over to the right side of the plot, you'll see during dry conditions, we get a decrease in storage. During wet years, we get a small increase in storage. That's pretty typical. And then we would expect our 10-year long-term average, if it's representative of long-term average conditions, which we think it is, results in very little change in storage. So that's looking at the watershed as a whole and thinking about the water balance. We can also think about our mass balance from the perspective of just looking at the groundwater system by itself. And if you do that, you really have two main inflows. You've got your infiltration recharge. This is water that percolates through the soil zone and makes it into the underlying bedrock and becomes groundwater. And then the other main inflow is stream bed recharge. So that's water that was flowing in a stream and it becomes, it disappears into the subsurface and recharges the groundwater system that way. Similar to precipitation, or even more dramatic, you get really big swings in this infiltration recharge term. Very little recharge during a dry year, something like 1 inch per year watershed average. Much higher recharge in a wet year, maybe even order of magnitude higher, about 10 inches per year watershed average. If we look at some of the other outflow components, I'll define a few of those. So interflow, that's water that makes it into the subsurface, but it has a pretty short residence time, so it rather quickly discharges in the days and weeks following rainfall. We have base flow, so that's water that was in groundwater storage but is discharging to streams. That's important for helping drive the late summer base flow, stream flow conditions. Spring flows, those are most people know what spring flow is, basically groundwater discharging to the land surface. Sometimes that's, what you think of as a quintessential spring where there's water gushing out of the ground, but really more often than not, it's more diffuse than that. It's water seeping from a bedrock face, perhaps over miles of stream bank, something like that. Another term, ET from groundwater. So that's water that plants that are actually able to have a tap root down into the water table are extracting from the groundwater, similar to the way a shallow well would extract water. Groundwater pumping is another outflow term, and you can see the magnitude of that as it compares to some of these other components, and then the change of storage on the right. I probably should have stated up front that we're stating all of these water balance terms in units of inches per year, so you can think of that as sort of a rainfall equivalent. So this is the depth of water equivalent over the entire watershed. So of course, there's going to be higher rates in certain parts of the watershed and lower in others. This is just thinking about it globally for the full watershed. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit, but I noted that variability in infiltration recharge, but it's also important to note that some of the other components don't vary very much. Things like Springflow is pretty steady. You know, it's probably driven by more like decadal variations in precipitation rather than year-to-year variations, and so don't really see a big response in the short term to a couple of years of drought, say. Same thing with the ET from groundwater, pretty consistent through time. So I mentioned that that water balance can be expressed in a more distributed way. Basically, we have distributed maps for all of these water budget terms. So this is looking across the landscape at that infiltration recharge term for the 10-year simulation period average. And we get pretty wide spatial variation in infiltration recharge. Really, a lot of the watershed has very low recharge rates. It means the soil water balance is pretty tight. Most of the water that's infiltrating is consumed by vegetation as evapotranspiration, or there's also some bedrock control where water that tries to recharge is essentially rejected as interflow because the ability of those geologic materials to accept that water is pretty low in many cases. So we should see rates on the order of 0 to 4 inches per year across much of the watershed. That's kind of the yellow and the lightest green tones in the map there. However, we do have portions of the watershed where we see really pretty high recharge, and that's primarily the upper watershed. So the areas along St. Helena Road. I'll use my cursor there if you can see it. So some of these blue areas in here. And the reason we have high recharge in that area is, or really a couple of reasons. First of all, we have relatively high precipitation. That's where a lot of the precipitation in the watershed falls, where rates are the highest. The underlying geology is able to accept that recharge pretty readily. There's a lot of tufaceous material that's basically fused together ash in a volcanic bedrock material that we call a tuff. So that material can accept water pretty readily. That's where a lot of the spring flow occurs, and we'll talk more about that in a couple minutes. And then the last major important factor is the soil permeability or hydraulic conductivity. So high rainfall, soils that can accept that water, and then underlying bedrock that can also accept that water from the soil zone. Those things come together to give us recharge rates somewhere between 10 and 20 inches per year in much of the upper watershed. Another important term is the spring flow. So in some systems, a lot of the summer base flow is driven by groundwater discharge, or in most systems. In Mark West Watershed, most of that groundwater discharge is really coming in the form of spring flow. And most of that summer water we see persisting in the stream is directly related to the locations and rates of groundwater discharge or spring flow. So this is where the model predicts springs that persist throughout the year, even during drought, all of those blue areas. You can see a lot of them line up with the stream channel network. And it's not necessarily saying water is discharging directly into the stream. It's more bank seepage, where you have steep bedrock banks exposed in that upper watershed. You're getting a lot of seepage coming out of that, and that is really what's responsible for producing a lot of the late summer base flow. We also do have what you might think of as a more typical spring that's not occurring in a stream channel, but just as a point on the landscape, and you can see those distributed throughout. What else did I want to say here? Most of the spring flow is happening in the upper watershed, and that's pretty important to our overall thinking here. It turns out if you look at just this watershed area above Van Buren Creek, so something like this area, that's accounting for about 55 or 60% of the total groundwater discharge in the entire watershed. even though it only represents about 20% of the watershed area, or even a little less. So we think that this upper watershed is really critical, and we've been thinking about it kind of like the hydrologic engine for this watershed. It's really where the base flow is coming from that we see up there in the upper watershed, but also persisting downstream. Pretty high concentration of springs also in the Humbug Creek watershed. And Mark West, once you get below Leslie Creek, we pick up a pretty good groundwater discharge or spring system again. What you'll notice in the middle watershed, though, is a pretty long reach with a lack of stream flow inputs. And that is probably important for the temperature situation, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. So next I'm going to show you a cross-section through the subsurface along this alignment. So this is through across Mark West Creek watershed in the upper watershed. So this gives you a peek into how the model represents the groundwater system and how we've conceptualized the subsurface. We looked at several hundred well completion reports to try to understand the distribution of geologic materials in the subsurface. Of course, it's a much simplified representation of reality. The real geology is very complex. You've got a lot of alternating layers of that tufaceous ash material I mentioned earlier, interfingered with various hard rock materials, mostly andesite volcanics in the upper watershed and mostly basalt in the lower watershed. You've also got some Franciscan complex. This is a much poorer aquifer material, much lower hydraulic conductivity, doesn't transmit water as readily as much of the volcanics do. And then we've got some alluvium, not a lot. It's pretty thin throughout most of the system. In the area around the Porter Creek confluence, we see a fairly significant alluvial body, maybe as thick as 50 feet. But generally, the alluvium is really this thin mantle of sand and gravel that's generally less than 10 feet thick, and even less than that in many places. So when you look at the geology here, you'll notice on the highland areas, we have a pretty thick unit of tufaceous material shown in that kind of buff pink color. As we go down to greater depth, generally the amount of tuff that we found in well completion reports decreases with depth. And in the lower part of our sequence here, which goes down to 800 feet below land surface, we see primarily andesite material. So that's water, that's material that doesn't transmit water as well as the tufaceous material. You can see the values for hydraulic conductivity listed here. So that's a measure of how readily water can transmit through these materials. And you can see the conductivity varies pretty widely, something like 0.6 feet per day in the tuff down to 2/100ths of a foot per day in the andesite. And then the Franciscan complex likely has even lower hydraulic conductivity, probably an order of magnitude lower than the andesite. The other thing you'll notice here are all these lines. You can see the horizontal lines here, and then they become more vertical here. Those are what we call equipotentials, and they're lines representing where the model shows equal head elevation or equal pressure in the aquifer. And basically what that helps us understand are the flow directions. So flow is always going to be perpendicular to those equipotential lines. And you can see we've called out some flow paths here, and you'll note how they're perpendicular to those equipotential lines. We see a pretty interesting flow system developing here. We've got a lot of water recharging into the tuff in the upper highland areas. That water is moving vertically and also horizontally, where we have relatively steep topography and where we have a contrast in hydraulic conductivity between more tuff-like material and more andesite-like material. We get that spring system developing. So those springs that are responsible for our summer base flow are really driven by this process of having tuff in the highlands exposed along stream banks and other places where you have dissected topography, and then popping out on the land surface as springs at various locations. We can get a sense for how long the travel times are through these materials also by doing some travel time calculations. There's some uncertainty in these. We have to make estimates of porosity to do these. So we've given a range here, but it gives you some sense, something like a decade or 3 decades even to move water something like a mile through the subsurface from where it would recharge to where it would appear as a spring farther down by Mark West Creek. Even longer travel times through the Franciscan, which can't transmit water as readily, maybe as long as 50 or even 100 years in some cases. So it gives you some appreciation for the relatively slow rate at which water is transmitted through the system. And I think that's important going forward as we talk about some of the impacts of various actions that we could take. So getting down to Streamflow, which is really what we want to predict more than anything with our model. We can look at Streamflow at various times of the year. We really focused in on 2 periods, the spring, which we're calling April through June here. So this shows mean or average discharge during those 3 months throughout the watershed. We can see some spatial variation, generally flows increasing in the downstream direction, as one might expect. A lot of variation from year to year. In the average condition, in our middle reach, we've got flows on the order of 8 to 10 cubic feet per second. If we look at a dry water year, we can see those flows are more like 4 to 6 cubic feet per second. And then if we look at a wet year like 2011, those flows ramp up to as high as 10 to 20 CFS. And of course, there's a lot of variation within that April to June period. This is just a helpful overall metric to look at the average conditions during that time frame. We can also look at the summer period. We're defining that as July through September here. So we have obviously much lower stream flows during summer than we do in spring. We don't see as much variation from year to year as we do in the spring discharge, but still some variation. Flows are pretty low throughout the system. If we look at the average condition flows in the middle part of the watershed, we can see there's something like 0.6 to 0.8 cubic feet per second. So pretty low. We look at a dry year like 2015, those flows are more like 0.4, 0.5 CFS in the middle reach. And then in a wet year, they bump up closer to 1 CFS. And that's again, the average discharge across the full summer period. So there obviously are variations within that, and we will talk about some of those as well. One thing to note here is this relatively dry reach right above, and that's where we have that relatively thick alluvial body, so pretty thick body of sand and gravel. We see a lot of flow disappearing, and we actually see some disconnection or zero stream flow at some portions of the dry parts of the drier water years. We're looking at basically a simplified view of just Mark West Creek. We've got a waterfall at the upstream end that's basically the limit of where salmonids can migrate through or move through the system. It's a passage barrier. As we move downstream, I've called out various confluences with some of the major creeks just to help you orient yourselves as you look at these different maps. So in addition to talking about discharge, we can talk about water depths. And really from a salmonid perspective, the water depths are probably what matters more than the number of cubic feet per second. Water depths. That concept, but essentially in most stream channel pools, which are the slowing deep areas of the channel, and riffles, which are the shallower parts of the channel where water depths are small and velocities are higher. And so we can look at the depth at those riffles because that's really what our model is capturing and representing. We have a model topography. It doesn't capture how deep water is in pools. What it does capture is variations in the channel geometry that are more like what we experience at riffles. And we've done quite a bit of field work to verify that that is in fact fairly consistent with what we measure in the field as a riffle depth or riffle crust thalweg depth for those who are more familiar with that term. So the deepest part of the riffle. We see some variation in those riffle depth range, and that's looking at the minimum or the driest condition of the year. Some variation from water year to water year, but not a ton. The only places we're really consistently remaining low Porter Creek. And you can note in the dry year, we have that small reach above Porter where we go basically to zero discharge as where it falls into that alluvium and goes subsurface. Most of that water reappears further downstream, so it's not like a permanent loss from the watershed. It's really a short reach that's seeing subsurface flow and then flow reappearing. So the next step, once we had all of our various water depths and discharges simulated, was to try to relate those conditions to it's helpful when thinking about salmon habitat to think about the various life cycles that salmon experience and understand what we're trying to accomplish or what we think the limiting factors are for some of those life cycles. So we talk primarily, when we're talking about flow, we're mostly thinking about juvenile summer rearing habitat, but also smolt out migration to a lesser degree. So juvenile summer rearing, that is, those are salmonids that are basically trying to survive through the summer months as stream flows are declining. There's a lot of challenges they face as flows decrease, the water quality in the pools that they're residing in, of finding enough food to eat, which are basically aquatic insects or benthic macroinvertebrates. So if we think about a goal for what we like to see to have good or sustainable juvenile summer rearing habitat, well, we'd like to maintain base flows or low stream flows that are high enough that they protect the water quality in the pools where the salmonids are residing. We'd like them to be high enough to be supportive of the aquatic insects that the salmonids are feeding on, and like them to be high enough that they provide some resiliency to climate change if there are future decreases in those low flows. And we'll talk more about what those predictions look like for Mark West a little bit later. If we think of smolt out migrations, these are fish that are ready to move out of the system down to the ocean. They primarily move during the spring months.
Turn off your video camera. The sound's getting choppy for people.
Okay.
Maybe that would help.
Gotcha. Gonna pause for a minute here to.
Yeah, Jeremy, you may also try being able to call in.
Is the sound bad enough that you think I should call in on the phone, Kevin?
Yeah, the sound is still pretty choppy, so maybe try calling in on the phone and we'll see if that can work.
Okay.
Sorry, folks, just bear with us here.
All right, bear with us, folks. Gonna try to.
Jeremy, I just muted your laptop audio, so hopefully let us know if your phone is working, like in the chat, perhaps.
Folks hear me on the phone now? Matt is nodding, so I'm going to assume that's better. Great. See some comments to that effect as well. All right, so let's move forward. I was talking about smolt outmigration. Down and into the ocean. Basically, the goal here is to maintain passable flow conditions, so riffle depths that are high enough that those fish can move when they want to move, and that's basically the late part of the winter into the spring when those fish move. And so we'd be thinking about what are the riffle depths in relation to that timing of outmigration. We know there's other life stages besides summer rearing for juveniles and smolt outmigration that are important. They're not really the focus of this project, and they're not so limited by flow, but they are important to consider, and those are things like spawning and winter rearing habitat. And so while those aren't the focus of the project, we did consider those conditions generally when we're doing some of our prioritization of reaches and understanding where the best habitat conditions are. We tried to consider that as well. So I'm going to talk a lot about riffle depths and be referring to a 0.2 foot riffle depth threshold as we go forward. And I don't really have a slide to explain that, but essentially there's a lot of work that's been done locally to suggest that a riffle depth of around 0.2 feet is generally a good target as a minimum, so not necessarily optimal, but a minimum target. We have some local data from Sea Grant that suggests that when you maintain those riffle depths above 0.2 feet, you're generally protecting the dissolved oxygen and water quality conditions in the intervening pools. We've collected some data in Mark West that shows when you can maintain those riffle depths above 0.2 feet, you're generally getting velocity conditions at the riffles that are supportive of the aquatic insects salmonids need to be able to feed on. And the last way we can think about that 0.2 foot depth threshold is as a fish passage threshold. It's a pretty low number. You see 0.3 and 0.5 thrown out in the literature as well, but I think 0.2 is a useful number as sort of a bare bones minimum value you'd like to remain above if you're going to allow fish to move either between adjacent pools during the juvenile rearing season or out of the system during outmigration. So when we look at all of our results together in terms of a Streamflow classification, so this is based only on Streamflow, and it's really centered around that 0.2 foot riffle depth threshold, and we define different criteria around that. So if you have a score of 0 or 0 criteria met here, shown in red, that means that the riffle depths are falling below 0.1 or 1/10 of a foot most of the time. And if you go up to a criteria score of 4, or most suitable in the darkest blue tone there, that means that the riffle depths are staying above 0.2 feet continuously, even during drought years. So that's sort of our not optimal target, but our minimum target would be, let's see if we can maintain riffle depths above 0.2 feet all of the time, even during drought. And as you can see, we're not accomplishing that in the system currently. The upper watershed is rarely maintaining those depths above 0.2 feet, and you can see that in the orange and red tones. The middle part of the watershed is somewhere in between. A lot of the times the riffle depths are above 0.2 feet, but they're dropping below during drought. And really, it's only that lower watershed below Leslie and around Leslie there, and then farther down at Reebley, where we're consistently maintaining riffle depths of 0.2 feet. So while from this perspective of just looking at flow, it's really the lower reach that is looking very promising. But when we start to look at some of the other factors, we'll see why perhaps that's not the most important reach for habitat. Maybe it's a little farther upstream, and we'll go through that next. So water temperature wasn't really part of our original planned scope of work. However, it became pretty obvious as we started working with the available data that temperature is a pretty big deal as a limiting factor in this watershed. So what we're looking at here are temperature data from a variety of different folks that have been working in the watershed over the years. Each data point here represents a temperature sensor that was placed at a specific location and monitored temperature continuously throughout the summer. And then I've extracted from those records what we call the mean weekly maximum temperature, or MWMT. So that's a measure of not the very worst case temperature conditions for a single day, but sort of the worst week. How high did the temperatures get during the hottest temperature week of the year? And that's a pretty commonly used metric to evaluate temperature from a habitat perspective. And so I put various red lines horizontally here, and these are representing different temperature thresholds that might be important for salmonids. We often see a target temperature threshold of 18 degrees Celsius as what we would call unimpaired if we can stay below that 18. As we get up to something like 21.1 C, we might begin to see severe stress in salmonids that are experiencing those temperatures if they're for prolonged periods. So we might call that severely impaired. And if temperatures really get high enough, something like 23 degrees C, there actually may be direct mortality of salmonids. Those temperatures are lethal, especially if they're sustained for any period of time. So what we see here was that we have impaired temperatures to some degree, really everywhere that we've measured. So the left side here, we're in more of the upper watershed around the Monon's Rill tributary, and as we move down, we're getting down to Porter Creek on the right side. Generally, temperatures are at least staying below that severely impaired threshold, down to about Van Buren Creek. So they're kind of in that 18 to 21 range. As we get down to Van Buren, we start seeing temperatures getting above that 21 degree threshold in places. And as we get down closer to Porter Creek, we see really everywhere that's been monitored, the temperatures are getting up above 21, and they're even getting up into that lethal category in some places. So this is a pretty important limiting factor for coho and other salmonids in the watershed. One sort of bright note is we do see that there are some pools within this reach that generally has pretty high temperatures, where the temperatures are a bit lower, close to that unimpaired level. Those are deeper pools that are probably very important for coho. They're key cold water refugia, and possibly the only places that salmon can persist, especially during a drought, if you're experiencing temperatures in that severely impaired lethal threshold in most of the reach. And maybe there's only a handful of pools that are really able to provide that deep water refugia. We think that's pretty important to the goal of improving habitat or maintaining it going forward. So we made a very simple water temperature classification map based on that data. This is pretty preliminary. We have a fair amount of data, but we don't have really any data down below Porter Creek. And we also don't have a lot of water years involved here. Nevertheless, it seems pretty clear from the available data that temperatures are better in the upper watershed, not necessarily unimpaired, but at least not severely impaired. The middle reach, kind of between Van Buren and halfway between Humbug and Porter, we see severely impaired temperatures, but at least we were seeing those deep pools that seem to be providing more cold water refugia. And then as we get farther down, things really seem to start to fall apart. We see lethal temperatures in really most water years that were monitored as we get down above Porter Creek area. And then we also have that flow problem where we have basically zero flow during some of the drier water years in part of that reach as well. So we tried to understand what are some of the controls on these very high temperatures. And we actually don't think flow is really the main control on the water temperatures. We looked at, tried to tease out relationships between temperature and flow, and we don't see a lot of relationship. We basically see that the temperatures vary as a function of the air temperatures and from location to location, but not really as a function of flow. We actually saw lethal temperatures in that lower reach when flows were as high as 1.5 CFS. So that's maybe 3 times as high as the lowest flows that were experienced in that reach. And so because we don't see temperatures improving with flows up to 1.5 CFS, we don't think we can really solve or mitigate this temperature problem by improving stream flow. More data is needed on this, but it's likely that the main ways to improve or sustain the temperature conditions we do have are to encourage deeper pools and more of these cold water refugia. Make sure we have good canopy shading the stream. Mostly we have decent canopy in this stream, but there's definitely reaches where the canopy could be improved. So those are likely to be the key factors to helping the temperature situation. And what gives us some encouragement are some of this data that Dave Hines collected at CDFW. So this is looking at 6 different pools where that had a temperature sensor measuring temperature consistently. This is that same mean weekly maximum temperature. And you can see the shallower pools around 2 feet deep experienced temperatures several degrees C higher than the deeper pools that were more like 4 feet deep. And so this is giving us some encouragement and some guidance that really we should be trying to find, enhance, and maintain these deep pool conditions because that's where the temperatures are going to be key. But really, we think there's some more study needed of temperature. We did a fair amount with what we could, but temperature wasn't really part of our project. So more to learn there. So the next thing we tried to do was combine that flow-based classification I showed you a few minutes ago with the temperature classification to understand the overall picture for habitat, in particular for juvenile rearing, but also for the smolt outmigration. And this is what we came up with. Essentially, as I mentioned, things are impaired everywhere, but really the best combination of not so bad temperatures and not so bad flow conditions is that middle reach. So the reach kind of below Alpine Creek, a little below Van Buren, down to a point about 2 miles upstream of the Porter Creek confluence. That's where we believe we have the most suitable habitat conditions. So combination of reasonably okay temperature and reasonably okay flow. The upper part of the watershed, we don't see riffle depths being maintained above our targets. So we think that's more flow limited than it is elsewhere. And then the lower part of the reach, we know we have more severe temperature impairment. So while the flows might be better down here, the temperatures might actually be worse. We don't have a lot of temperature data or any temperature data farther down. And there are some springs there, so it's possible those temperatures improve farther downstream. Then we consider other factors from available data, things like what the bed materials are like and are those suitable for spawning habitat. It's pretty clear that we have pretty marginal spawning habitat in the upper watershed. It's a lot of bedrock, a lot of coarse material, not as much gravel. Some of the older Fish and Wildlife Habitat surveys also show there's quite a bit of fine sediment that is not really what you want to see for optimal spawning habitat. And then when we look at the lower watershed, we think the spawning conditions are probably pretty poor there as well. In this case, because the velocities are really high and there might be some issues with reds or nests of salmon eggs being scoured out during high winter flows. So taking all that into account, really, it's this middle reach that seems like the key reach for providing habitat for salmonids that's suitable from various perspectives. A couple of summary slides, and then we'll pause for some questions here. In terms of stream flow, we found we have highly variable flows in the spring, pretty low but consistent summer stream flows. We don't see a lot of what we call pool disconnection or zero flow conditions, and that's a very good thing. A lot of the salmonid streams in the Russian River do see some reaches go completely dry. Here we only really see that in the short reach above Porter Creek, so that's a good thing. That probably relates back to that spring system in the upper watershed that's consistently providing us cold summer water. In terms of the water budget, we see a lot of spatial variation in recharge rates. Again, the upper watershed seems really important for generating a lot of that recharge. Pretty low recharge rates in a lot of the rest of the watershed. Summer base flow seems to be driven by vertical groundwater flow in the Sonoma volcanics and the way that produces springs and bank seepage. We think of that upper watershed as really the hydrologic engine for the watershed. where we generate a lot of that recharge and a lot of that base flow that sustains our summer stream flow. If we look at water use conditions, we found that the primary uses, or the primary source of water is really from groundwater, about 85% of the use from groundwater, and the primary uses of that water are for residential and vineyard irrigation, with various other uses accounting for the rest. One way we can think about that total water use is comparing it to the mean annual recharge. You know, in a severe situation like we see in the Central Valley where we have groundwater overdraft, that basically means you're pumping out more groundwater than is recharging the system. So clearly we're not in that situation here. We're nowhere near that. We've got something like 3 to 7% of the mean annual recharge being extracted from wells in a given year. And that variation is really depending on how you define that recharge term. So significant groundwater pumping, but not alarming from an overall water balance perspective. In terms of our habitat summary and our restoration recommendations, we found widespread impairment both by low stream flows and by elevated water temperatures. And we found that that 4-mile reach from Alpine Creek to 2 miles above Porter has the best overall conditions for coho and other salmonids. We think some additional data analysis is justified and needed in that reach in order to describe temperature conditions and controls and also find those cold water refugia. We really don't know if there's just a handful of those cold water pools or if there's dozens of them. It'd be good to do some additional temperature monitoring and field identification of those critical refugia locations. We think it makes sense to find those refugia and try to protect them, and that's going to mean either it could mean placement of large wood structures to help maintain those deep pools or potentially scour new pools, and it might mean repairing canopy planting projects where the repairing canopy isn't as complete as we might like it to be. So the whole idea, deep shaded pools, protect and enhance those critical temperature refugia. We think those types of projects are the actions that are going to make the most of the benefit, or the highest benefit going forward. So at this point, we'll pause for some questions, and I think Kevin's going to field those for us and probably read them out loud to everybody.
Jeremy, I'm going to chime in with one real quick. The worst part of the audio quality came when in slide 17 you were trying to describe what we call riffles in our modeling effort. Maybe you could just take a moment to summarize that.
Sure, no problem. So I mentioned that our model is built on topography that we get from a LiDAR data set, and that's remotely sensed topographic data. It doesn't capture the deeper areas of the channel that we call pools. What it does capture are the shallower portions of the channel that we typically call riffles. So these are, in a typical stream, you'll have deep, slow water areas and shallow, fast-moving water that we call riffles. And we have done some field work to understand that, yeah, when we simulate a given water depth in our model, that's loosely equivalent to what's happening at riffles. And so we're thinking of our modeled water depths as analogous to riffle depths.
Okay, so there's a few different questions that I'm going to try to go through here. So the first one was actually really early on, and they were asking about, are the flow rates used for calibration considered daily averages? And that was way back to slide 8 was the reference, or potentially?
Yeah, they are definitely mean daily discharges. So both the model and the instrument in the channel are actually capable of measuring discharge at a 15-minute interval, but we're averaging everything to a mean daily discharge. There's a few places in our results where we looked at data at a finer time scale than that, but for calibration and for most purposes, it's mean daily discharge.
And then also on slide 8, Rick Rogers was asking, it appears that the model is overestimating flow volume, especially in spring and fall for the Rancho site. So the question is, what is an acceptable error in those simulated values?
That's a very good question. There's a number of statistics we can look at, and I have some of those plotted here. So we can see the ME stands for the mean error, RMSE is the root mean square error, NSME is something called the Nash-Sutcliffe Model Efficiency Coefficient. That's perhaps one of the most useful metrics. So a value of 1 there would be really the perfect fit, and a value of 0 would be a pretty terrible fit. So we're pretty happy with that value of 0.9 there. Anything above 0.65 or 0.7 is usually considered a valid calibration. And then I've also put the volume error there. So on the total water year basis, we're under predicting the volume at Michelle Way by about 6%. So, you know, when I'm pretty happy with this calibration. We don't really expect to see perfect agreement with any model. And the more complicated the model, the more difficult it is to calibrate, but also the more useful the model is. So getting a calibration of this quality with the model this complicated, we're pretty confident in that the model can do a good job of helping us understand reality and predict future and existing conditions with the degree of calibration we have here.
Okay, so there's another question from Ray Krause. He was asking, so you show annual water usage. How does seasonal use affect conditions, i.e. higher irrigation pumping during summer and early fall?
That's a very good question. I think we should defer that, because when we exit this question period, we're going to launch into talking about scenarios, and several of those scenarios deal with that question of pumping and pumping timing.
Yeah, and this next question might also be relevant to that second part of the presentation. So let me just read it real quick. What is the effect of groundwater withdrawal on stream flow and riffle depth during key summer months, July through September?
Yeah, again, I think we should, if I haven't answered that after the next question break, let's bring it up again.
Okay, and then, yeah, there's another question about, what have you been able to determine about the canopy loss due to Tubbs fire and loss of shade temperature increase on the middle stretch? Any more specific recommendations for vegetation restoration? Would that be also in the second part?
Not so much.
Okay.
You know, when we scoped our project, it was before the Tubbs fire. So obviously, simulating the fire was not part of our scope of work. We did simulate the fire because we felt it was necessary. A lot of our calibration data happened just after the fire occurred, and so we needed to build some representation of that in the model. But we're not looking very deeply at fire impacts, and certainly not at specific canopy damage conditions. That's not part of our scope of work. We have identified that high priority reach, so it would make sense to do some more detailed canopy assessments to see if there are areas where the fire really changed the canopy that require extra restoration. I think that's a good idea, but beyond what we're talking about here.
Okay, there's a number of other questions that I'm trying to get a sort through here. One from Bob Selecki is asking, regarding the lack of deep pools and shade that would benefit salmonids, is this due to anthropomorphic impacts, or has the watershed always lacked these habitat characteristics?
That's a somewhat difficult question to answer. We don't have a lot of information to go on for the historical conditions. We have basically no historical stream flow information. We do have some habitat surveys that Fish and Wildlife has done over the years, and those might go back to the 50s or 60s, and they do describe some pool depth conditions, but probably not in the detail that you could really say whether pools have gotten shallower or deeper over time. I think it's more likely not so much of an anthropogenic influence. It's more of a geomorphic influence. We have bedrock outcropping in the channel in a lot of places, and so that really puts a floor on how deep of a scour pool can be developed. So places where the alluvium is pretty thick, yeah, you can scour a 4 or 5 foot deep pool, but if the alluvium is inches or a foot thick, and then you're down at bedrock, you're not going to get deep pools. And so that underlying geomorphic and geologic control is a key driver of pool depth.
Yeah, and one other thought on that. This is Matt. I think that the forest contributions of wood to the streams, you know, it's hard to know over time, but it seems like, you know, the extent that there's coniferous forest types with Doug firs and some redwoods coming in to a forest that is really dominated more by hardwood and mixed forest types. It's not that clear to me that we would really expect that this system would have had lots and lots of woody debris in it compared to other North Coast streams like in the Redwood region.
Okay, so let me just try to get to a couple more because I think some of the other ones are going to be answered in the second half. Just really quickly from Rob Pennington, have you calculated errors for only the low flow period?
Definitely, yeah, we'll have error stats calculated separately for low flow. I don't really have those to pull up and show you, but the bulk of our calibration effort was really on what you see in the lower plot there for different water years, trying to get that spring recession and that base flow. So definitely looked at statistics.
Okay, and one more from Dan Worth is asking, are the model input data available to people that request it, specifically Streamflow and groundwater level data?
I think that the answer to that is probably yes. We haven't fielded this question yet. And I think I don't want to just blithely say, oh yeah, sure, no problem. I think that's probably the answer, but we should take that up with specific requests and figure out exactly how that's going to work.
Let's see. There's a couple more questions, but I think just in the interest of time, I'll keep track of these other questions and hopefully we can get to them at the end, but I would like to continue with the presentation just so we can.
Sure. And Kevin, just one other thing about questions that may not get answered over the course of this webinar. We'll have a record of the questions and we will respond to questions that don't get answered in some fashion. I think a lot of you who are asking these questions know where to find us as well.
Okay, thanks, Matt.
Okay, so we're going to move on to talking about the scenario analysis. This is maybe the most interesting part of the project. You know, the first 2 years, or probably everything up until this point, this is really the last year of the work. So when we talk about scenarios, again, we're talking about playing out various what-if scenarios. We can ask a variety of questions of the model and then try to use the model to understand how given hypothetical action would manifest in terms of changes to the water balance or stream flow conditions. So we can think of our scenarios in a few different categories. We had a variety of water use scenarios. Now, these aren't intended to be realistic actions that could be taken necessarily. They're more intended to understand how sensitive is the system, or what is the total stream flow, how is the stream flow being affected by the cumulative water use in the watershed. So to help us understand that, it's useful to simply turn off water uses. So we turned off all of the surface water diversions as an individual scenario, turned off all of the groundwater wells as an individual scenario, and then turned them both off as a third no water use scenario. Again, that's not implying that that's a realistic goal of no groundwater pumping. It's to understand how sensitive is the system to groundwater pumping and how depleted is it under the current pumping regime. We also looked at land and water management scenarios. So this is more getting at scenarios that we think could or maybe should be implemented in the future. We looked at a variety of these. One is forest fuels treatment. Obviously, after the Tubbs fire and the Kincaid fire, there's great interest in understanding should we be managing our forests in a different way to help reduce forest fire risk, fuels management, thinning, perhaps controlled burns, and that, you know, there might be very good reasons to do that forest management for those perspectives, but we think we hypothesize there might be a water balance or stream flow benefit to some of those thinning or other forest treatment options as well. And so we wanted to understand if large-scale forest treatments happen in the watershed, is that going to improve stream flows, or is it maybe even a reason to consider doing those forest treatments? We also looked at grassland compost treatment. So this is a strategy that's been employed. I think some of this work began with the Marine Carbon Project. The primary goal here isn't necessarily hydrology. It's carbon sequestration, but again, by treating soils with compost, there's some evidence that we can increase the soil holding capacity, the water holding capacity of those soils, possibly increase recharge and stream flow as well. So similar to the forest fuels management, it's a scenario that may be implemented for other reasons or may want to be implemented primarily for other reasons, but we want to see, is that a strategy that can improve stream flow as well? Recharge enhancement. So this, there's a lot of things that could fall under recharge enhancement. We're mostly thinking about places where we have concentrated runoff happening from developed areas, mostly rural residential development, rooftops, driveways, roads, places like that. Are there ways that we can manage that stormwater to encourage more infiltration and more groundwater recharge and less runoff? And if we do that at a large scale, does that improve stream flow? We also looked at pond releases. So this is simply releasing water from existing or possibly new ponds in the watershed during critical times to try to augment stream flow. And we have a combined management approach where we've combined all of these strategies to sort of one master scenario where if we do everything, how effective would that be is what we're trying to say there. We have climate change scenarios. We looked at 4 different global climate models. You can see the acronyms there, and we'll get into some of more of those details in a few minutes. And then we have some mitigated scenarios as well, where we looked at a future climate condition from one of the models that predicts sort of more pessimistic conditions for salmonids, and looked at that future climate in combination with some of our actions like combined management on the landscape or pond releases to see are those actions large enough to sort of mitigate or allow for stream flow improvement even when we look at a future climate condition. So we're going to launch into some of those. We'll begin by talking about the water use scenarios. So this is simply a map that's showing all of the surface water diversions in the model with triangles there, and all of the groundwater wells that we have identified with circles. Something like 750 wells in the watershed and something like 45 or 50 surface water diversions. Most of those, or many of those, are direct diversions. You can see in the yellow triangles. Some are ponds, you can see in orange, and many are also spring diversions where someone has a spring box that they're using as a water source. So again, these water use scenarios are pretty simple. One is turn off all the diversions, one is turn off all the wells, and one is turn everything off and see how the system responds. So it's useful to go back to thinking about the mass balance or the water budget when we think about the pumping impacts. This is looking at the no groundwater pumping scenario. Essentially what we're doing when we pump groundwater is we're introducing a new outflow or increasing the outflow from the system. And so the system is going to respond to that increase in outflow in one way or another. And what we find in this work and what others have shown is in the short term, in the years after, years or decades after pumping begins, most of that change really happens or manifests itself through a change in the total storage in the aquifer system. So in this case, what I'm showing on the plot here is shutting all the wells off, running the model for various 10-year cycles, so starting with the first 10-year cycle up to 50 years or 5 10-year cycles. So we can see after that first 10-year cycle, most of the response to the cessation of pumping was a big increase in storage in the groundwater system. And we see the stream flow respond as well. Something like 17% of the pumped volume showed back up in the stream after 10 years. As we proceed and march through time, those changes in storage decrease down to near zero after 50 years, and the effect on the stream or the stream flow depletion increases over time. So after 50 years, we're seeing that something like 68% of the total pumped volume has appeared as an increase in stream flow, and that hasn't stabilized completely in our 50-year simulation, but we think it's pretty close to stabilizing. We don't expect that stream flow depletion number ever to get all the way to 100% because there's other changes, such as changes in evapotranspiration in the subsurface, and we can also change the recharge rates a little bit when we change pumping regimes. So, but it's basically thinking about it from the water balance perspective is pretty useful. And what we find is given enough time for the system to equilibrate, which does seem to take a lot of time, several decades, most of the pumped water will be streamflow depletion given enough time to equilibrate. It's more a question of when that occurs in space and time and whether those impacts are significant. That becomes important to think about. That long time scale has some pretty important implications for managing groundwater resources. Basically, it tells us that the decisions we're making on the landscape now aren't going to show up in the stream potentially for decades or even longer. So it's very important we make the right decisions. We won't really know whether we have until quite a ways down the road. So we can look at the timing of changes in stream flow when we stopped all groundwater pumping. We can think of the change in stream flow that occurs from pumping as something called stream flow depletion. And so this shows the change in the monthly stream flow averaged over the model throughout our 10-year window. And this is after 50 years of no pumping. And what we see is during the summer months, the change is pretty small in terms of cubic feet per second, something like 0.06 CFS, which is equivalent to about 6% of the total summer stream flow. And where we see larger increases actually during the winter time. And I know this is going to seem somewhat counterintuitive to people. If you're thinking of a typical alluvial aquifer system where you have lots of summer pumping in the summertime, and there's a big seasonal drawdown of the water table, then yeah, that summer pumping is going to directly cause a stream flow depletion. But when we're talking about a bedrock system like this with decadal response times, really that's all very muted. And so the system doesn't appear to respond to the timing of groundwater pumping really whatsoever. So it seems to make very little difference whether that's summer pumping or winter pumping. And the reason we see more of the effect actually showing up in the winter versus the summer is because that it's really proportional to the total groundwater discharge that's happening. So that's what we're affecting. That's affecting stream flow is that groundwater discharge. So winter months, we've got a lot of groundwater discharge happening. Small change in gradients and heads from pumping produces a relatively larger change in stream flow. Whereas during the summer months, when we have less spring flow and groundwater discharge happening, those subtle changes result in a smaller change in stream flow. And that's what you can see illustrated here. Moving on to talk about diversions. So this is surface water diversions. I'll note here that we obviously had to make a number of assumptions about not only where diversions are occurring, but what the rates should be, and also the timing of those diversions. So we decided to make a pretty conservative assumption that everyone is diverting at the same time, and all of the diversions are active on the first of the month, and then there's various timing depending on what the use is, but essentially we're looking at a worst case scenario where there's no coordination among diverters, everybody's pumping at the same time. The reality is probably something not quite so bad as that, but there's probably not a lot of coordination happening either. So I think it's a pretty good assumption, but probably worst case. And what we see are basically some substantial, significant short-term impacts, but the overall sustained impact throughout the summer is actually pretty small. We see a lot of the impact happening in the Humbug Creek watershed and then showing up in Mark West Creek right below Humbug Creek. You can see that in the plot on the bottom. So we see changes in stream flow of almost up to 1/10 of a CFS during times when all the pumping is active. But then when the pumps are shut off, the stream flow returns near its no pumping condition. And we can look at that in another way in map view. So these are similar to the earlier maps I'm showing you. This is 3 different ways we could look at those summer diversion impacts over the summertime. So if we look at the mean summer discharge, you can see the effect of the diversions is very small, something like 1/100th of a CFS in this middle reach. If we look at the minimum discharge, so the very worst day of the year, the effect is a little greater, something like 2/100ths in the middle watershed. And then if we look at the instantaneous impact, so what's the most of the streamflow changed at any one 6-hour block of time, that's where we see the larger impacts, and those are, of course, short-term impacts, and those can be up 0.08 or 0.1 CFS. So there's, it's important to think about in different ways. These instantaneous impacts might be important, but they're obviously not as significant as a sustained impact, which would be more likely to lead to changes in pool water quality or other impacts to Salmonid. Not saying it's not important, just it's important to make that differentiation between a short-term impact and a long-term impact. If we look at our 3 water use scenarios together, so now we're just looking at the mean summer discharge across the entire summer period, on the no diversion scenario on the top, the no groundwater pumping scenario in the middle, and then shutting off both diversions and all wells on the bottom. You can see the groundwater pumping effect in terms of sustained impact is larger than the no diversion impact. When we look at them both together, we're getting total streamflow, sustained streamflow depletion of something like 0.02 to 0.04 CFS in this middle reach. So to summarize those water use scenarios, total existing summer streamflow depletion from all sources in terms of sustained impact appears to be about 8% of the summer flow. So significant, but not dramatic. The pumping impacts on streamflow really appear to be driven by subtle changes in vertical pressure gradients in the Sonoma volcanics and the effects that has on Springflow. So a little different than a lot of people might be thinking of pumping impacts. We're not talking about a cone of depression that intersects the stream and induces a decrease in streamflow. We're really talking about subtle changes in those vertical gradients and how that affects the springs, which are really what's responsible for that summer base flow. The model really doesn't show evidence of seasonal pumping impacts or streamflow depletion hotspots. The effect seems to increase in the downstream direction. We didn't really see individual wells that are problematic. It seems to be more the cumulative effect of the pumping that is affecting the streamflow. We think that has some pretty important implications, again, for groundwater management. There's been a lot of discussion of forbearance, so the idea of not pumping in the summer in favor of pumping in the winter and then storing that water in tanks or other ways of storing it as a way to improve streamflow. That might work for surface diversions, but in a bedrock setting like this, we don't really think that's going to have a substantial effect on streamflow. So if you can offset your pumping by capturing rainwater, great. You're reducing the volume that you're pumping. But just shifting the timing of that pumping from summer to winter, not likely to be a big game changer here. Those long response timescales imply to us that a volume-based management approach is likely the way to go rather than a timing location-based approach. So considering the total amount of groundwater use in a given sub-area and trying to define some kind of limit on that, or at least tracking it on a volumetric basis. Strategies moving in that direction are probably more likely to protect or enhance streamflow than strategies focused on saying, okay, you can pump as long as you're not 1,000 feet, as long as you're more than 1,000 feet from the stream, or things like that. We don't really think those approaches are appropriate or applicable to a bedrock setting like this. Stream diversions might have some short-term effects on streamflow, but we don't think they have really sustained impacts. Okay, so I'm going to transition to talking about the various management scenarios, and after those we'll pause and then wrap up with the climate change scenarios. So the first one is the forest fuels management, and for all of these scenarios we tried to go pretty large scale, try to say, okay, if we do sort of the most that makes sense on the landscape, how does that affect streamflow? Obviously, it's optimistic to think that we can achieve some of these larger scale changes, but it's, again, the main goal is to understand the sensitivity, which actions are more or less effective than others. So we think forest management is likely to be needed for fuels reduction. The goal here was to see if it affected the water balance in the stream flows. We did some mapping of forest conditions up at Monon's Rill. We related some of those conditions we saw on the ground in the forest there to leaf area index measurements that were taken and derived from the LIDAR. So those are measurements of the density of the canopy, and those can be are important for understanding how much water use or transpiration there will be for a given forest condition. And they show us, they really show us nicely the variation in forest conditions across the landscape. So we should see, certain areas where either, trees are relatively thin, or maybe there's been some controlled burns or thinning activity. We see a smaller leaf area index value versus a forest that is heavily overgrown, hasn't burned in a long time, has a much higher leaf area index value. And then there's been some ladder fuels mapping that's been done at the county-wide level, I think. And our map based on the leaf area index, where we've identified the priority areas for forest treatment, it corresponds pretty well to that ladder fuels mapping. The reason we want to use our leaf area index is because that's really our key parameter for driving this scenario in our model. So you can see here we've identified two forest categories, Doug fir forest and oak forest, and where we think major or minor forest treatment might be justified. This is a remotely sensed product. We don't expect this to be right on a parcel by parcel basis necessarily. We hope that it captures the overall picture pretty well and gives us some idea of the acreages involved. Clearly, more site-specific forest conditions mapping is needed if you're going to actually go implement a thinning project in a given area. So the total acreage is something like 7,100 acres. I'll also note, and maybe you can tell from the map here, that I've excluded the footprint of the Tubbs fire. And it's not necessarily to say that fuels management isn't needed in areas that burned in the Tubbs fire. It's more saying we don't understand what is needed in those areas as well. All of our leaf area index data is pre-fire, so we don't even really know what the leaf area index looks like exactly in those recently burned areas. So we thought it made sense to exclude that because of that uncertainty. So that's reflected in the pattern here in the acreage. Moving on to the grassland management scenario. Again, this reflects large-scale applications of compost as a way to increase the soil organic matter and be able to store more water in the soil. This is a map that Pepperwood helped us put together. Shows most of the grassland areas in the watershed. We masked out any places where the grasslands weren't at least 2 contiguous acres. This represents about 2,875 acres across the watershed. You can see there's less of this in the upper watershed where a lot of the Springflow is happening. A lot of this is concentrated in the Porter Creek watershed, but there is a significant amount, particularly down here in the southern part of the watershed. In our recharge enhancement scenario, basically what we're representing here is if we implement large-scale stormwater best management practices, so people might have heard of the 3 S's, slow it, sink it, spread it, or 4 S's if you count storage in there too. This is the goal. The idea here is to say, okay, if we work with landowners who have significant impervious area or hardscape, roads, driveways, rooftops, to route that water from those surfaces to somewhere where it can infiltrate and produce recharge, how much of that is needed to make a difference, and how much of a difference will it make to the overall recharge and stream flow picture. So we had a pretty large scenario here. It's about 310 acres. These are places that are coded as developed in our vegetation mapping that we have available to us. They're the larger developed areas that are at least a half-acre contiguous developed area. And we're not really representing the details of how you would manage the stormwater in those areas. That's really beyond what we're trying to do at our model scale here. We're simply saying, okay, if we take the runoff produced from these areas and we're successful at infiltrating it, be that through an infiltration basin or a series of bioswales or other features, what effect does that have on the water budget? And our last category of a management scenario are the pond releases. We looked fairly comprehensively at all the ponds in the watershed. There's really only a handful of ponds that seem like they're large enough to have a viable release project, so they have enough water in storage for releases. We identified 3 of them that seem to have enough storage and be strategically located, one in Upper Mark West, one in Humbug, and one in Mill. We've estimated the available storage from the data that we have available to us from those ponds, and we've also ensured that those are ponds that have enough drainage area above them that they fill and spill even during drought conditions, and actually even during our dry climate change scenario water years. So, they're still fairly small ponds that are on the order of up to 15 or 18 acre feet, I think is the largest one. So they fill pretty easily because they're not that large and they have significant upstream drainage area. The total volume of water in those 3 ponds that we're releasing is about 34 acre feet per year. We looked at 2 different release strategies. Of course, you can think of a lot of others as well. One is really focused around augmenting summer stream flow for juvenile rearing habitat. And looking at the hydrograph, timing of about middle of June to middle of September probably makes the most sense for that. So if we dribble that 34 acre feet out over that 3-month period, that's equivalent to something like 0.19 CFS. Another way we might think about releasing water, and the reason for this will become clearer when we talk about the climate change scenarios, is we might think about more of a concentrated or pulse release in the springtime to help with the outmigration situation. Perhaps we would time that around the end of the primary outmigration window, which Sea Grant has helped us determine from their outmigrant trapping data that that's really kind of the late May timeframe when about 80% of the smolts have generally outmigrated. So we looked at, I think it's a 21-day period or 20-day period in late May there. And of course, if you release that 34 acre feet over a shorter period, then you can get a larger bump in flow, something like 0.82 CFS. And the last assumption I want to point out is that we didn't use all of the assumed available pond storage. We actually assumed that half the storage would need to be retained in those ponds, either because there's existing recreational uses or water uses in the pond, or because there's just a desire not to draw those ponds down all of the way so that the water's there in the event of a forest fire situation. So we've assumed 50% of the pond storage is available for flow release, 50% must be retained. Again, this is pretty preliminary based on remotely sensed data. If we're going to actually go and pursue a pond release project, we would need to, of course, do some more careful estimating of storages and volume. Let's jump into the results of some of this. This is looking at how the water balance responds to the forest management, grassland management, and recharge enhancement scenarios all together. You note the different water balance terms, and here I'm showing things not in inches, but as a percent change relative to the existing condition. So I'm going to start here by pointing out the infiltration recharge. So we might think of the goal of all of these actions as to increase infiltration recharge as much as possible. And in fact, all 3 scenarios did increase infiltration recharge on the order, watershed-wide of something like 2 to 4%, which is a substantial volume of water when you consider that across the entire watershed. The way that increase in infiltration recharge is accomplished differs substantially between the different scenarios. So if we think of the forest management, here the goal is to reduce that AET demand through forest thinning so that the forest will consume less water, and thus there'll be more water available for soil moisture storage and infiltration. In fact, we do see that effect. If we look just at areas that were treated, the AET decreases under treatment by something like 5%, and we think that's pretty realistic. Most of the literature on this relates to clear cutting, and it shows that a clear cut will generally provide about 20% reduction in AET. So if a clear cut provides a 20% reduction, a thinning procedure that produces a 5% reduction seems to be about right in terms of the overall gut check there. Of course, we're not treating the entire watershed, only about 28% of it. So at the watershed scale, that's really like a 1.5% reduction in ET that we see. If we move on to the grassland management scenario, here the way we're enhancing infiltration recharge is by allowing the soil to actually store more water, so spreading out the length of time over which that infiltration recharge can occur. So we're not really trying to affect the aids here, the runoff necessarily. We're trying to affect the available or the capacity of the soil to store water. And yes, that's also an effective way to increase recharge, is what our model's telling us. Lastly, with the recharge enhancement scenario, here what we're trying to do is actually get this bump, this drop in runoff. We're trying to take water that would have run off to streams during the winter and capture that and allow it to slow, sink, and spread and infiltrate into the subsurface, and it does in fact do that as well. On a per area basis, the recharge enhancement is by far the most effective scenario. Remember, that's about 300 acres versus 2,800 acres for grassland management and over 7,000 acres for forest management. The grassland management would probably be the next most effective when we look at it on a per acre basis, but not as effective as the recharge enhancement. And we saw quite a bit of variation in the grassland scenario where certain soil types were able to, the grassland treatment was able to exert a pretty big bump in recharge compared to other soil types. And I'm not really going to talk about that more today, but that will be described in our report for sure. If we look at some of the other terms, ultimately what we're trying to influence besides the infiltration recharge is this Springflow term that is critical for summer base flow. And we can see, yeah, all three of those actions on a large enough scale can result in changes in Springflow or increases on the order of 2 to 7%, depending on the specific scenario. So looking at how those scenarios manifest in terms of augmenting or improving summer streamflow, the infiltration scenario on the top there, pretty small effect, something like 2/100ths of a CFS. The forest management, modest but not insignificant, something like 0.02 to 0.04 CFS in the middle watershed. The pond releases really show up as our most effective individual strategy for improving stream flow. If we did that 0.19 CFS summer release, that's going to give us an improvement in discharge of something like 0.06 to 0.08 CFS in the middle of the watershed. The reason the pond releases seem so effective is we're pretty well set up for it here. We've got a stream reach that's mostly gaining from groundwater, doesn't have a lot of big alluvial bodies or big losses into the subsurface like we would see in some other Russian River coho streams. So it's really set up for a situation where that released water will persist in the downstream direction. Moving on to another summary of the summer stream flow, you can see our various scenarios here, the water use scenarios, and the land and water management scenarios. This is a nice way to see which scenarios were more or less effective than others. Of course, the most effective is the combined management, where we're combining all four of these actions into one. And you can get a pretty substantial boost in summer stream flow where those actions to all be taken together, something like a 25–30% increase in the summer stream flow. The individual scenarios, obviously less. And you can also see how the summer releases are the most effective individual strategy by themselves. So to summarize those scenarios, we see that there's a lot of inertia in the system. It's really not that easy to affect the water budget in a meaningful way. If we do very large-scale landscape and runoff modifications, we can affect the water budget meaningfully, but they really need to be pretty large-scale scenarios to make much difference. All of the strategies did promote or protect existing summer stream flow, potential total improvement up to around 25%, and we found that the pond releases are the most effective individual strategy. And while there's certainly some implementation challenges, I think it's a pretty fair argument that implementing 3 pond release projects is probably a lot easier than treating 7,000 acres or developing 300 acres of stormwater management infiltration projects. So we really see those releases as the low-hanging fruit. Although I will point out that all water is not created equally when we think of the temperature effect. So pond releases are going to need to be looked at carefully in terms of their effect on temperature, and anything that could enhance Springflow is probably going to be even more beneficial because that's cold water coming into the system. Going to pause in just a moment, but we can do some prioritization of those. I know those were large acreage numbers that I was throwing around there. May seem pretty daunting, but if we focus in, we think it makes sense to focus on the upper watershed that contributes to our high priority coho reach, which again is kind of in this area here. And then we think it makes sense to focus even more on the very upper watershed as the highest priority, because that's where most of the spring flow is generated. In fact, about 75% of the spring flow in the watershed here contributing to our high priority reach is coming just from this highest priority upper watershed above Van Buren Creek. And if we look at the acreage totals, they obviously become more manageable when we try to hone in on these high priority areas. But they're still pretty substantial. So that's sort of the menu of available project options that could be undertaken in those areas. So I've been droning on a lot here. We probably have maybe 15, 20 minutes more presenting after this question break. So keep that in mind, Kevin, as we answer some questions here.
Okay, yeah, we've gotten quite a bit of questions. Matt and some other folks have answered some of them, but let me try to just knock out a few here. So let's see. Bruce Abeliaman was asking any thoughts on strategic recharge projects in the upper watershed to enhance the hydrologic engine, and there's kind of some other questions about that, about like enhancing different springs or seasonal wetlands up there to kind of recharge that hydrologic engine in the upper part of the watershed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty difficult at this, with remote sensing data and at this model scale to say whether a recharge enhancement project is going to work on a particular parcel or in a particular part of a parcel. Probably need to do some more site-specific investigation, but anywhere where you're concentrating runoff currently, I know a lot of people manage their runoff by essentially the strategy of let's get it off my property and do a roadside ditch as quickly as possible. You got a lot of that happening, significant impervious surface. There's a lot of potential there to disconnect those connections to roadside ditches and try to route that to a series of swales or an infiltration basin. We think that can be a very effective strategy, so encouraging interested in doing that type of work to talk to the RCD and others about possibly implementing something like that. We're also looking at another strategy along those lines up at the Pepperwood Preserve, and that is basically augmenting an existing meadow to try to enhance meadow recharge by maintaining longer inundated conditions in that meadow by managing the outlet. It's possible there's some opportunities for that in Upper Mark West. I'm not sure.
Okay, let's see. Sierra Cantor asked a question earlier in regards to, is dissolved oxygen data available for some reaches with flow and temperature data in areas that meet minimum riffle depths but are temperature limited? Are the dissolved oxygen concentrations meeting water quality objectives for salmonids?
There is some DO data, not a lot, but I would say that in general, no, that 0.2 foot riffle depth is not enough to, or maybe that's not the right way to say it, but we see places where we're maintaining the 0.2 riffle depth, but the temperature and the dissolved oxygen are still falling well into an impairment level. And again, we don't think flow is really the control on temperature and DO here. We don't think we can solve the problem with more flow. We think it has more to do with shading, with ongoing changes in climate, and with the depth of pools.
Okay, and then Ray Cross had a question about the effectiveness of rooftop rain capture and storage in the area. And I think you somewhat addressed it, but if you just want to touch base on it again.
Yeah, I think that's a very good strategy. Anything you can do to reduce the total volume of groundwater that you're pumping, or certainly if you have a surface water diversion, if you can offset that, that's definitely going to help the situation. I think the storing water that you're pumping in the winter in order to not pump in the summer, we don't think that strategy makes as much sense, but storage of roof water, catchment water, or runoff certainly makes sense. It's going to help the total pumping situation.
Okay, and Penny Sirota has a couple different questions about one, like kind of the impact of groundwater wells in the upper area, in the upper area of the watershed, and if that might have a kind of disproportionate, a greater effect on the watershed versus, say, pumping in the other area.
Yeah, that's a really good question. You'll see on my very last slide, we have a few things left to do, and one of those is we're running sort of a side set of scenarios where we're selectively turning off certain wells in the watershed to understand, are there characteristics that we can use to define higher versus lower impact wells. We haven't worked all the way through that, so I really can't talk in great detail about it, but my hypothesis certainly is that the groundwater pumping that's occurring in the upper watershed where the hydrologic engine is going to have a bigger effect than pumping that's happening elsewhere where there's drier reaches or lack of springs. But we'll hope to say more about that by the time we conclude our project.
And then a couple other questions from Elizabeth Ruiz. She's asking, how would you gain in cubic feet per second from summer flow releases? Sorry, how would the gain in volume, like flow from summer flow releases, translate into Riffle depths? And then how much depth would be gained by the pond releases?
That is a really good question. I actually have a figure showing the pond release effect on riffle depth, so I think we should just do that.
All right, I think there's a couple more, but I'll save those till the end.
Okay, sounds good. Not a ton more to go through here. Just climate change, which is obviously a big topic in itself. We chose 4 climate model scenarios to look at. Global climate models there's a number of them. They have a number of different assumptions. They have pretty wide variation in what they predict future climate will look like, particularly in our area. They all predict warmer conditions. You can see here on this figure, which is from previous work that's been done, that the range of predictions is something like less than 1 degree C to around 6 degrees C increase in temperature, in max temperature. That's shown along the x-axis here. And on the y-axis, you can see the projected change in annual precipitation. And that's where the models vary even more widely. You can see some of the models are predicting total precipitation to decrease by something like 25%. Other models are saying we're going to get 40% more precipitation. So a lot of uncertainty about the trajectory of precipitation, more certainty that, conditions are going to get hotter in the future. So there's been a lot of work done on climate change scenario downscaling and modeling in the North Bay and even in the Russian River specifically. A lot of that is part of the North Coast Resource Partnership work. Pepperwood and the USGS have both been instrumental in doing a lot of that work as well. And so we really built off of that existing body of knowledge that those folks have put together. And this is on various climate models that we have downscaled climate model data available for in our area. And we followed existing guidance on some of those existing studies of which scenarios to pick. We weren't going to run all 18 of these, so we select 4 following the guidance of those previous studies that try to capture the range of potential future climate. We shouldn't think of any one of these as more correct than the other. We should think of them as equally likely future climate conditions. And there's uncertainty there, obviously, as you can see by the range of predictions. So those are the 4 futures. For those who are more familiar with climate change impact scenarios, there's also the emissions assumption. So 3 of these are an unmitigated assumption, kind of a business as usual, and 1 is a mitigated scenario, which is the GFDL model there. So note that all of the models show an increase in temperature, some of them more extreme, like the MEROC model. 2 of the 4 we selected show an increase in annual precipitation, and 2 show a decrease. I also want to point out here that all 4 of the scenarios, possibly all 18, I'm not sure, show that springtime precipitation is going to decline. So they show more seasonality of precipitation. So more precipitation happening in the core winter months of January, February, less in the springtime, like in the fall, in October and March. So here you can see the mean annual precipitation, or sorry, the mean monthly precipitation for existing in black and our 4 climate change scenarios in the colors. And you can see that even in those 2 climate change scenarios where mean annual precipitation is projected to increase substantially, the models still show spring precipitation decreasing. And I think that's important when we start looking at spring discharges and the possible effects on the outmigration situation for coho salmon. Figure on the right is an example of downscaled global climate model data. These are available from work that the USGS has done with their basin characterization model. This is just an example from one of the scenarios showing future change in precipitation on an annual basis and how that varies across the watershed. So jumping into the results in terms of the water balance, similar to what I showed you earlier for the management scenarios, except now we're looking at the 4 different climate scenarios and how the water balance changes as a percent of the existing condition. The effect is really variable depending on what model you look at, not surprisingly. 2 of the models show that increase in precipitation, 2 show a decrease. Changes in AET are fairly modest in most of the models, certainly compared to the changes in runoff and infiltration recharge, which could be pretty dramatic depending on what model you look at. In terms of infiltration recharge, one of the models shows a really pretty big increase in recharge, something like 45%. 2 of them show a pretty substantial decrease in recharge, and 1 shows very little change. So there you go. There's your bracket. Not super helpful for managers going forward, but that's really the state of the uncertainty with these models and what's going to happen, particularly in our area, where there's, I think, more uncertainty of the precipitation predictions than in other areas of the country. Streambed recharge and Springflow, really variable impacts. If you believe the CNRM climate future, things could be looking pretty good in terms of spring flows, possibly substantial increases. But the other 2 models that show drier predictions show substantial drop-offs in spring flow. And I would point out that these percent changes are substantially greater than the changes we see for many of our other scenarios. So potentially very difficult to mitigate against some of these more dramatic worst-case climate predictions. Looking at effects on stream flow, we can see the mean summer discharge, and I've just picked 2 of the climate models to show here to basically show the range of predictions. So the CNRM model in general predicts the smallest or most favorable streamflow conditions in the future, and the MEROC model predicts the most worst case or dramatic reductions in streamflow. So in the CNRM model, we actually see an increase, a small modest increase in summer discharge. In the MEROC model, the summer discharge drops almost in half, something like 0.3 CFS in that middle reach on a long-term basis. Another way to look at it is with this chart that I showed you earlier. Earlier I was just showing you this set of scenarios. Now we've added the 4 climate futures as well as 2 mitigation scenarios. So you can see the scale of the increases in discharge that we might be able to achieve through the various management actions. And then you can see the scale of the predicted changes in stream flow from the climate change scenarios. So clearly these 2 more worst-case scenarios are showing big reductions in discharge, bigger than what we could offset with any of the individual management actions anyway. 2 of the scenarios show either a small decrease or a modest increase. So what I did was focus in on this GFDL scenario. So it's not the worst case future climate prediction, but the second of the 4, and then tried to look at that future climate in combination with either just our summer flow releases or with all of our combined management actions, and that's what you can see on the right here. So flow releases by themselves, not enough to offset the impacts of that climate prediction. However, all of the management actions together actually appeared to be enough to offset some of the more worst-case climate futures. And of course, if the situation really looks like one of these climate models, then those management actions would have potentially even lead to improvements in summer stream flow in the future. So definitely some uncertainty there, but I think this is helpful to give people an idea of what the future trajectory might look like, but also how significant the management actions might be in relation to what might happen as a result of climate change. When we start to look at the springtime discharge, that's where things start looking a little uglier, unfortunately. Big drops in springtime stream flow throughout all four of the climate scenarios. So as I mentioned, even those scenarios that show more precipitation on an annual basis, they show more seasonality, so less spring precipitation. And that has a pretty dramatic effect on the summer stream flow. Obviously, these are much larger changes than anything we could accomplish with our individual management actions. There might be some mechanisms to use pond releases to help with the situation, and I'll talk about that in just a sec here. Actually, I'll talk about that right now. So what we're showing here are going back to the riffle depth. So someone had asked the question, are these changes in flow meaningful or large enough to affect the riffle depths in a meaningful way? And this gives you some sense of that. So here we're looking at one of the reaches that's more limiting. So this is below Mill Creek, and this is also during the driest water year in the simulation. So you'll note in the existing condition in blue, our riffle depths are even above, staying above 0.3 feet throughout April or throughout March and much of May. And again, this is during the driest year conditions. They drop off substantially in May and June, and then they flatten out somewhere around 0.1, 0.15 summer months. If we look at our GFDL future climate, really dramatic losses of riffle depths in the March-April time frame. They're really falling below that 0.2-foot threshold as early as late February, and that's kind of the peak of the out-migration window. So this is pretty concerning in terms of the smolt out-migration picture, I think. However, if we look at adding pond releases to the situation, we can think about using the pond storage in at least two different ways. On the top here, we can think about that spring flow release. And, I didn't try to optimize that timing or that rate based on what I was seeing. I was really just targeted around the end of the out-migration window. So you could imagine you could get even greater benefits if you were really managing this in more of a real-time fashion. But you can see, yeah, the pond release volume released over a short period of time is enough to bump riffle depths up from below 0.2 feet to above 0.2 feet. So that can make a big difference for out-migration, particularly if you have a spring where you've got riffle depths below 0.2 feet all spring. Post-flow release in the late spring, get those out-migrants out. That could be a pretty viable strategy, I think, going forward. There's really no way to, bump the average spring flow condition up enough to make a difference. So we need to be thinking about, can we do some pulsed releases to help out migrants for a specific window in time. Then if we look at the other way to use pond releases, more of a sustained summer effect, again, we can see that, yeah, we can pretty much offset the effects of that GFDL climate. So one of the worst case future climate predictions. You can note that the pond release values in black here are pretty close to the existing condition. In this particular reach, yeah, they're below the 0.2 foot, but again, this is one of our more limiting riffle locations. So yes, we can meaningfully affect the riffle depths and potentially mitigate, if not all, at least some of the negative effects on stream flow that we're likely to see coming our way from climate change. To summarize, we see more extreme drought conditions under all of the future climate models we looked at, as well as more seasonality to the rainfall, in particular that loss of springtime precipitation. Uncertain effects on the groundwater recharge and summer base flow picture, possibly some improvements, possibly some significant reductions. We really don't know there. So if we want to plan for resiliency, we should probably be planning for some reductions. If those don't manifest, great. Dramatic reductions in springtime flows, I think that's what we know more with more certainty from this work, that springtime flow is going to drop off, and we think that might be a pretty big concern for smolt outmigration. We find that our management actions likely can mitigate or even improve summer base flow under future climate, but probably not the overall springtime flow picture. However, the way to try to mitigate might be flow release pulses during the outmigration window. In terms of global summary of our recommendations from the study, we think it makes sense to implement large wood and riparian planting projects, particularly in that 4-mile high priority reach that we helped identify. It seems like those deep shaded pools are pretty critical for providing temperature refugia. So any of those large woody debris projects or planting projects that we can implement to improve those deep shaded pool conditions likely to have a disproportionate benefit relative to other actions. We really see the pond release projects as the low-hanging fruit of the various management actions available as potential options. We think that we should really, consider even enhancing existing pond storage. We've got a number of ponds that probably could be viable for a flow release if they were augmented and the storage was enhanced a little. We could potentially consider developing new ponds. Really having some ponds to work with and release flow from is probably our best strategy in terms of being able to adaptively respond to climate change or manage flows on a year-to-year basis, if that's even the desired goal. Some question of whether that kind of management makes sense or not, I can understand as well. In terms of the other options, forest, grassland treatment, and runoff management, they all appear to be effective on a per acre basis. Clearly the runoff management or recharge enhancement makes the most sense, followed by the grassland treatment and then the forest management. Of course, as I noted, there's other reasons for maybe wanting to do the forest and grassland treatment work for fuels reduction or carbon sequestration. We think those actions can help provide additional resiliency to climate change, in particular because they're going to help with the cold water availability situation. So those pond releases are not going to necessarily give us real cold flow inputs. All water is not necessarily created equal. An increase in stream flow of 0.1 CFS is likely better than an increase in pond release flow of 0.1 CFS because of the temperature effect of that increased spring flow. Finally, in terms of groundwater management, we really think a volume-based approach makes the most sense here. We should be focusing on trying to preserve that critical groundwater discharge in the upper watershed by thinking about our total volume of groundwater we're pumping and maintaining an acceptable level there so we don't deplete stream flows in an unacceptable manner. We're mostly done with our project, but we have a couple months left. In that time, we'll be working on, as I mentioned, testing the sensitivity of pumping location or depth on stream flow impact, see if we can provide some additional guidance on what type of wells might have more versus less impact. If any, we're not really expecting to see dramatic differences there other than an upper to lower watershed contrast. We'll also be querying our results to see where various actions are more or less effective. In particular for the grassland management, there definitely seems to be certain soil conditions that result in a compost application having a greater benefit versus other soil conditions. And finally, we're working on some conceptual designs, some pretty different looking projects. One is a meadow recharge enhancement project up at Pepperwood, and another is a recharge enhancement design associated with some of the new park facilities that they're going to be constructing near the Porter Mark West confluence there. We're happy to accept input, answer questions. We will be working on this probably continuously until we have our final report due in about 7, 8 weeks or so. With that, we can wrap up and handle questions for as long as Kevin wants to keep this going here.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, for the presentation and for everyone that's been participating here. I know we have gone over time, so thank you for sticking with us. And let me just try to get to a few more questions here before we wrap up.
And Kevin, let me just say one thing before you go into questions. We really appreciate the good questions and comments that have been going on in the chat as we've been going along. And to the extent we can integrate some of those questions and create more answers in the final report, we will certainly do that. And we can certainly continue to take input to the extent we can and try to accommodate how we provide output in the terms of the report. One of the things about this modeling project and the number of different kinds of data this model generates is that there are a lot of different ways you can analyze and present the data. And so trying to figure out what to focus on is one of the big challenges. Go ahead, Kevin. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Matt. Let me just try to get to a few questions here from Jennifer, who's asking, the best recharge areas seem to be in the upper watershed, mostly in the heavily forested areas. Did you examine loss of those forests due to vineyard conversions or climate change?
Well, we can certainly look at the contrast in recharge in existing vineyards versus forests for vineyards that have already been converted. We didn't look at any future conversion of forest to vineyard, but we should be able to tease out from results that we have whether the recharge situation changes substantially when you go from forest to vineyard. Haven't looked at that yet, but that's something we can take note of.
Okay. And yeah, Jeremy, can you speak up just a little bit more for the next one here? So the next question also.
Kevin, I'm sorry, can I just interject a little bit additional answer to that question? We may not be able to do that one directly in the context of what we're doing right now, but that's a great example of the kinds of things that you can do with a model like this once you have it set up. You can ask a question like that and you can crank it through the model and you can get at least what the simulation would suggest the result would be.
Okay, thanks, Matt. And so her other question was about Porter Creek and the Porter Creek subwatershed. She's saying that there's a significant recharge area up there and that the maps show improvement to ripple depths in the Mark West Creek just below the junction of Porter Creek. So can you talk to the importance of the Porter Creek subwatershed at all?
Sure. And Porter Creek isn't seen as great coho habitat from what I understand. The summer base flow conditions are much lower than they are in Mark West Creek. Temperatures are probably also higher as well. So in terms of providing habitat directly, we don't see Porter Creek as being as important. There's some small summer base flow inputs coming from Porter. Those are really going subsurface at the confluence, but that's still a flow input. So I do think it still makes sense to want to preserve or enhance streamflow in Porter Creek, probably more so for its contribution to Mark West than for providing habitat in Porter itself. Again, our perspective is pretty coho-centric. That was kind of the mission of our project. So there might be other aquatic species that would benefit more from enhancement work in Porter.
Okay, thanks for that. And then let's see. Lynn Garrick had a question about, what have you been able to determine about the canopy loss to Tubbs fire and loss of shade or temperature increase on the middle stretch of Mark West Creek? And do you have any more specific recommendations for vegetation restoration along that reach?
Yeah, again, the fire impacts really wasn't part of our initial scope, not something we looked at. We don't have detailed canopy mapping for that reach. That's one of our recommendations is to walk that 4-mile high priority reach we identified, assess the canopy conditions, and that can include where fire may have impacted things, and also assess the pool conditions. So we think a little bit of detailed field work trying to find those specific sites where that canopy enhancement should happen is what's probably needed there.
Okay. And then a question from Valerie Zimmer is asking, how easy is it to run a simulation in this model? Does one need to be a full Mike Shee user, or would they hire OEI?
Sure.
I'll take this one. I was just typing out a response to Valerie. You know, the reason we're doing this through Coast Range Watershed Institute is to facilitate that kind of thing going forward. Once we have this model up and running to actually do new scenarios to answer specific questions is certainly much less effort than sort of this whole project of getting the thing up and running. So I don't think we have the exact roadmap about how that will work or could work, but we certainly hope to be able to continue to use this model and to continue to answer questions with it. And again, that's kind of why Coast Range Watershed Institute's involved, to create this nonprofit platform to pursue that kind of thing.
Okay, thanks, Matt. And then just a comment from Ray Krause, just saying that, you know, the degree of bedrock fracturing seems to be pretty important. But I think Matt had answered that in the comments, or had addressed some of that in the comments. So just to be thinking about that. And I think that might be it. If I missed a question, I apologize. You can always email it to me. I send out my email to everyone, but please feel free to send me an email with the question, and I can forward that to Matt and Jeremy. And again, I will forward, or I will email everyone with a link to the recording of this presentation. And the recording has the chat notes and comments in it as the video is going. And then we can also email any separate questions to folks that have those. So again, just want to thank Matt and Jeremy and everyone else for participating. And I think we are probably going to end it there. So again, thanks everyone for attending, and feel free to email if you have additional questions, and otherwise have a great Thursday.
Yes, thank you all for participating. We appreciate it.
Okay, thanks guys.